a lighthouse the town called cursed, a signal at 2:17 in the morning, and a retired Navy SEAL who only wanted peace. But his loyal K-9 heard something beneath the concrete no one else would listen to. What they uncovered under the tide was not a ghost. It was the truth someone tried to bury. And when truth rises, darkness cannot win. If you believe God still uses unlikely heroes to bring light into hidden places, stay with this story. Sometimes the miracle is not the storm stopping. It is the courage God gives to face it. Follow this channel for more stories of faith and redemption. Turn on notifications and comment Amen if you believe light always overcomes darkness. Cold Harbor. Maine woke beneath a low ceiling of Atlantic clouds that pressed heavy against the shoreline, trapping the smell of salt, diesel, and wet rope in the narrow streets near the harbor, while gulls circled lazily above lobster boats that rocked against their moorings like tired animals waiting out another gray morning. At the far edge of town, where jagged rocks bit into the tide and wind never seemed to rest, the Whitaker Lighthouse stood alone, its stone tower stained dark by decades of storms, its lantern room cracked and unlit for 22 years. The locals called it Dead Tower, a name spoken half in humor and half in warning, because no one had lived inside those walls since the night of the great winter storm that took 2 men and silenced the beacon forever. Paint had peeled away in long skeletal strips, the iron balcony railing carried veins of rust, and the heavy door at its base sagged on hinges that complained even when touched by wind. On mornings like this, the tower did not look haunted, only forgotten, as though the sea itself had decided to let it rot in peace. The tide crept in and out beneath it, indifferent to human memory, dragging foam across stone, and retreating again without apology. It was into this quiet, skeptical town that Jackson Hale drove his aging gray Ford pickup, tires hissing against rain-slick pavement as he crossed the county line without ceremony. Jackson Hale was 39 years old, 6'3", broad across the shoulders with the dense, balanced strength of a man who had carried more than weight in his lifetime, his ash-brown hair cropped close in military precision, streaked faintly at the temples with gray that had arrived too early to be natural. His steel-blue eyes rarely rested in one place, moving with unconscious calculation, measuring windows, corners, rooftops, vehicles, a habit shaped by 16 years as a Navy SEAL deployed across desert coastlines and foreign cities where hesitation meant consequence. A short, disciplined beard framed a face marked not by age, but by exposure to heat, dust, rotor wash, and the quiet aftermath of missions that were never discussed outside classified rooms. Even out of uniform, he carried himself like a man still on duty. Posture straight, shoulders squared, movements economical and deliberate. He had not come to Maine chasing glory or escape, but silence, and the lighthouse offered that for the price of $5 and a stack of liability papers signed without hesitation. He stepped out of the truck in worn brown boots, rain sliding off the collar of his dark jacket, and the dock conversations around him slowed into that small-town pause reserved for outsiders who looked like they might stay. Beside him, emerging from the passenger side without command, was Ranger, an 8-year-old Belgian Malinois with a sable coat darkening along his spine and amber eyes that seemed always to be calculating distances and intentions before anyone else noticed them. Lean rather than bulky, built for speed and endurance, Ranger moved with controlled precision, muscles sliding beneath fur like cables under tension, ears pricked forward as he cataloged every scent the harbor offered. A pale crescent scar ran along his right flank, a reminder of the shrapnel he absorbed during a compound collapse overseas when he had dragged Jackson clear by the sleeve of his vest. Twice in combat, Ranger had intercepted danger before it reached his handler, and those moments had fused man and dog into something beyond partnership, into a quiet understanding that required no raised voice or leash correction. Even retired from military service, Ranger scanned rooftops, shadows, and distant figures automatically, tail level, posture neither aggressive nor submissive, simply alert. When a fisherman laughed and pointed toward the truck, Ranger did not react to the noise, but to the tone beneath it, stepping slightly closer to Jackson's left leg in protective alignment. His breathing remained steady, his focus absolute, because for Ranger, unfamiliar territory always meant evaluation first, rest later. The loudest laughter came from Hank Doyle, a heavy-set lobsterman in his mid-50s with a salt-stained red beard and suspenders stretched over a weatherproof jacket, a man whose cynicism had grown alongside declining fisheries and shrinking paychecks. Hank spat into the harbor and shook his head as Jackson unloaded a duffel from the truck bed, calling out, "You the one bought Dead Tower?" in a voice meant for the entire dock to hear. When Jackson nodded once without explanation, another man muttered that $5 was too much for a stone coffin, and a ripple of chuckles followed. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive in the way small towns protect themselves from change. Among the watchers stood Emily Carter, 34, owner of a modest boat repair shop near the marina, tall and slender, with wind-reddened cheeks and dark blonde hair pulled into a low knot, her hands roughened by sanding hulls and tightening bolts. Emily did not laugh, though she did not defend him either. Her father had once worked alongside the Lighthouse's final caretaker before dying in the same storm that extinguished the beacon. And that loss had shaped her into someone cautious but observant, someone who measured truth before speaking it aloud. Her eyes lingered on Jackson longer than the others did, not with mockery, but with curiosity edged by memory. The causeway leading to the lighthouse was narrow and slick, bordered by jagged rocks where waves slapped in restless repetition, and Jackson walked it without haste, Ranger pacing at heel as if escorting him into contested territory. The iron gate at the base of the tower groaned when unlocked, and the heavy wooden door pushed inward with a complaint that echoed through hollow stone. Inside, the air carried mildew and cold iron, and the spiral staircase curved upward into shadow, steps worn smooth by boots, long gone. Jackson moved through the structure in steady, methodical arcs, checking each window, each corner, each blind spot as though conducting a silent sweep, while Ranger circled the main chamber below, nose low, drawing in layers of scent left behind by time. The lantern room above was cracked and clouded, its glass panes streaked by years of salt, and the generator room below held a thick concrete slab where an old machine once stood bolted in place. Outside, rain intensified, drumming against stone and metal, while wind tugged at the balcony railing in sharp, irregular bursts. The lighthouse did not feel haunted, only neglected, but beneath the neglect lingered something Ranger could not ignore. As evening deepened, Jackson set a small lantern near the generator room and unrolled his cot along the far wall, the steady rhythm of rain against stone almost soothing in its predictability. Ranger lay down briefly, chin on paws, then lifted his head again, ears angling toward the center of the concrete floor beneath the old generator mount. He stood slowly, stepped toward the slab, and began sniffing in tight circles, claws ticking softly against the surface before stopping at a precise point as if guided by something inaudible to human ears. A low rumble vibrated in his chest, not yet a bark, more a signal, and when Jackson glanced over, he saw the rigid line of the dog's back and the fixed stare aimed directly at the floor. Jackson crouched and pressed his palm against the concrete, feeling only cold seeping through skin, and shook his head gently, telling Ranger it was probably rodents seeking warmth beneath stone. Ranger did not retreat, instead placing one paw flat against the slab and scraping once, then twice, his breathing shifting into that focused pattern Jackson recognized from overseas patrols. The lantern flame flickered as wind pressed harder against the tower, and somewhere above them, metal clanged softly against railing. Night settled fully over Cold Harbor, swallowing harbor lights in mist and turning the Atlantic into a dark, restless expanse that breathed against rock in long, steady intervals. Jackson lay on the cot without undressing fully, boots unlaced but within reach, the old discipline of readiness refusing to fade entirely, even in supposed retirement. Ranger positioned himself between Jackson and the generator room floor, amber eyes open, ears angled toward the slab, as though monitoring a distant transmission. Sleep came to Jackson in shallow waves, never deep, never complete, his body accustomed to rising at the smallest disruption. The storm outside intensified, wind rising and falling in unpredictable surges, rain tapping against glass like restless fingers searching for entry. The lighthouse groaned under pressure, stone shifting slightly in protest against Atlantic force. Yet beneath those natural sounds, something else lingered, something Ranger tracked with unwavering attention. At precisely 2:17 a.m., Jackson's watch face glowing faint green in the darkness, a metallic knock rang out from beneath the generator room floor, clean and deliberate, not the scratch of rodents, nor the settling of aging foundation, but a sharp tap of metal against metal that sliced through the lighthouse like a signal. Ranger was on his feet instantly, barking hard now, claws scraping concrete as he fixed on the exact center of the slab, muscles taut and ready. Jackson rolled from the cot in one fluid motion, pulse steady rather than panicked, and crossed the room to kneel beside the dog, pressing his ear close to the cold surface. The wind howled around the tower and rain hammered the stone, yet in the narrow space between heartbeats, the metallic sound came again from beneath his hand. Ranger barked once more, deeper this time, and Jackson remained crouched in silence, listening to the unseen presence below as the storm raged outside and the abandoned lighthouse no longer felt empty. The metallic knock beneath the generator room floor did not repeat again that night, but it did not need to because Jackson Hale had already shifted from suspicion to action, and by the time dawn began thinning the storm clouds above Cold Harbor, he was crouched over the exact center of the concrete slab with Ranger standing rigid beside him, amber eyes locked on the same point, muscles coiled but silent, the posture he used overseas when detecting concealed compartments that men insisted did not exist. Jackson worked carefully, not smashing through stone but studying the subtle differences in density along the surface, tapping lightly with the back of his pry bar, and listening for hollow resonance beneath solid tone, his breathing slow and deliberate as though the floor itself were an opponent requiring patience rather than force. Ranger scraped once at the faint seam that Jackson finally exposed along one edge, claws sparking softly, then stepped back and watched as Jackson chipped away the outer layer of patchwork concrete, revealing the thin outline of a welded steel hatch that had been buried intentionally rather than forgotten by accident. It took nearly 40 minutes to free enough of the seam to wedge the pry bar beneath the recessed handle, and when Jackson pulled upward, the hatch resisted at first, then released with a low groan of rusted hinges that exhaled a draft of stale air into the generator room, dry and metallic and untouched by recent tide. Ranger leaned forward immediately, nose testing the air column rising from below, then placed one paw on the ladder revealed beneath the hatch, as if confirming the path before stepping down without hesitation. Jackson clipped a compact lantern to his belt and followed, boots descending 15 feet into a narrow concrete corridor reinforced by steel ribs that still held firm despite the decades. And as his feet touched the floor, he recognized the deliberate engineering of the space, the kind of municipal tunnel built not for smuggling but for controlled access and maintenance. The walls bore faded stenciled warnings from the Cold Harbor Port Authority, and along the ceiling ran a line of old conduit piping that once carried power or signal to somewhere beyond the lighthouse itself. The tunnel sloped gradually toward the shoreline, and the air remained unnervingly dry, suggesting the system had been sealed against salt intrusion, and as Jackson moved forward, Ranger tracked several yards ahead, nose sweeping along wall joints and floor edges where sediment gathered in thin gray lines. After 30 yards, the corridor widened into a maintenance chamber, large enough to hold a metal workbench, 3 rusted filing cabinets, and a long shelf bolted against the far wall. and on that shelf sat a stack of water-stained folders bound by brittle twine that disintegrated at Jackson's touch. The top document bore a typed header, Thomas Whitaker, Harbor Engineer, Infrastructure Assessment, and beneath it a date that matched the year the lighthouse had gone dark 22 winters earlier. Jackson lifted the file carefully, scanning inspection reports detailing structural surveys of Dock 7 and notes regarding unexplained corrosion along underwater pylons that Whitaker believed were linked to chemical anomalies in harbor sediment. Ranger nudged a locker against the wall, and when Jackson opened it, he discovered a rolled blueprint of the lighthouse and adjacent shoreline annotated in firm block handwriting, arrows marking the tunnel's route, and circling a point offshore labeled Dock 7, below tide. Whitaker's photograph was paper-clipped inside one of the reports, showing a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, with dark hair combed neatly back, square jaw, steady eyes that suggested method rather than impulse, and Jackson studied the image longer than necessary, recognizing the expression of someone who had seen a problem and refused to ignore it. The final pages of the folder shifted tone from routine maintenance to urgent memorandum, referencing sediment samples that contained industrial solvents inconsistent with commercial harbor use, and several notes mentioned radio transmissions logged at 02:17 hours as part of a test cycle for an offshore monitoring system installed quietly beneath the lighthouse during infrastructure upgrades. Ranger lifted his head suddenly at that timestamp, as though recognizing the rhythm embedded in memory from the metallic knock above. And Jackson glanced instinctively at his watch before returning to the documents. The last legible entry in Whitaker's notebook read, "Signal active at 02:17, cycle confirmed, Dock 7 secure." And the handwriting pressed harder into the paper as if written under strain. Back in town, Emily Carter stood in the small archive room of the municipal building, fluorescent light casting a pale wash over the rows of labeled boxes that held decades of Cold Harbor's official memory. And she requested access to the winter storm files from Margaret Lowell, the town clerk in her early 60s, whose silver hair was always pinned tightly and whose careful speech reflected years spent safeguarding documentation after losing her husband in a fishing accident that left her distrustful of both water and rumor. Emily carried the quiet determination of someone who had grown up listening to her father praise Thomas Whitaker's precision, and when she opened the archive box, she found weather reports, evacuation logs, and council minutes from the week the lighthouse went dark, yet several pages bore subtle irregularities. Timestamps that skipped forward, route closures recorded before storm surge made them necessary, and a memo signed by then-council attorney Daniel Brooks recommending temporary restriction of Dock 7 operations pending environmental review. Brooks, now mayor of Cold Harbor, was a tall, polished man in his late 40s with neatly combed dark hair and a habit of speaking about economic stability in measured tones that avoided specifics. And Emily remembered her father once muttering that Brooks had represented industrial clients before returning home to pursue local politics. As Emily copied key pages, she felt the old unease that had lingered since her father's death sharpen into something more concrete, because the record suggested coordination rather than chaos, and she stepped outside into the brisk morning air with documents tucked under her arm and eyes drawn inevitably toward the distant outline of the lighthouse. Meanwhile, beneath that tower, Jackson packed Whitaker's blueprint and notebook into his bag with deliberate care, resisting the urge to assume conclusions before mapping all variables. And he continued along the tunnel until it terminated at a sealed metal door embedded in the rock wall, its locking mechanism corroded but intact. Ranger sniffed the seam and then the floor near the base, tail level, posture analytical rather than alarmed, and Jackson noted faint salt residue around the threshold indicating periodic exposure to tide, consistent with the blueprint's notation that Dock 7 lay below certain water levels. He did not force the door open because structural compromise beneath an active shoreline could collapse unpredictably, and discipline dictated that reconnaissance precede action. When Jackson climbed back into the generator room, lowering the hatch carefully but leaving it unsealed, daylight had fully broken over the harbor and the storm had retreated into scattered clouds drifting offshore. Ranger emerged beside him, coat dusted faintly with concrete residue, and stood in the center of the room as if recalibrating the space now that its hidden layer had been exposed. Jackson stood still for a long moment, absorbing the implications not with excitement but with measured acceptance, because the tunnel beneath the lighthouse transformed the building from abandoned relic into operational history, and the metallic knock at 0217 was no ghost, but a remnant of a timed system that once linked the tower to something offshore. He looked toward the harbor beyond the cracked window panes, imagining Dock 7 submerged beneath morning tide, and understood that whatever Thomas Whitaker had been monitoring 22 years ago had required secrecy and precision rather than publicity. Across town, Emily reached the marina and paused near her shop, the documents in her hands heavier than paper should be, and she knew she would have to speak to Jackson, not because she trusted him yet, but because the pattern emerging from archived records and the existence of a sealed tunnel beneath the lighthouse suggested that the so-called storm accident had intersected with decisions made deliberately. She did not yet accuse anyone, nor did she share her findings publicly. But she recognized in Jackson's quiet arrival the same refusal to look away that had defined Whitaker and her father before him. Back at the lighthouse, Jackson rested a hand briefly against Ranger's neck, feeling the steady warmth and grounded breathing of the dog who had detected what concrete tried to conceal. And he spoke quietly, not as a command, but as acknowledgement that the signal from below had shifted from noise to narrative. The tide continued to rise outside, swallowing Dock 7 beneath gray Atlantic water, and as Jackson closed the generator room door behind him, he understood that the lighthouse had not been silenced by storm alone, and that the path forward would require more than curiosity. It would require proof. Morning light over Cold Harbor carried a deceptive calm, a thin band of silver along the Atlantic horizon that made the sea look almost harmless. Yet beneath the lighthouse the tunnel felt colder than the surface air, as though stone remembered what men preferred to forget. And Jackson Hale stood at the sealed metal door at the tunnel's end, with Ranger pressed close to his left knee, the Malinois' posture rigid but controlled, ears forward, nose hovering near the threshold where faint salt crust marked the seam. Jackson did not force the lock immediately, instead kneeling to examine hinge corrosion and tide marks along the lower frame, calculating water height and pressure points the way he once calculated entry angles in compounds overseas, because the blueprint Whitaker left behind suggested the door opened not toward the tunnel, but outward toward a secondary access beyond the rock face. Ranger gave a low vibration in his chest, not alarmed, but insistent, and when Jackson finally wedged the pry bar into the weakened latch and applied steady torque, the metal groaned and yielded enough for the door to swing inward against its own rusted resistance, releasing a sharp rush of salt air that carried with it the scent of exposed shoreline and something chemical beneath it. Beyond the door lay a short continuation of the corridor, reinforced by older timber beams embedded into rock, a crude extension compared to the earlier concrete work. And at its end the passage opened to a narrow ledge carved into the cliffside just above the reach of high tide, partially concealed from open water by jagged rock formations that shielded it from casual observation. Ranger stepped forward first, scanning the ledge and then lowering his nose toward the rocky ground, tracing a faint trail that led to a cluster of stones arranged unnaturally near the cliff wall. Jackson followed, crouching beside the formation, and as he brushed aside loose rock and sand, he uncovered the corner of a corroded metal surface buried deliberately beneath layers of debris, the curved edge of an industrial drum that did not belong to any fishing operation Cold Harbor had ever sanctioned. He cleared more rock away with measured movements, revealing the first full barrel, its blue paint faded to gray, warning labels half erased, but still legible enough to read hazardous solvent waste beneath a peeling manufacturer's mark, And when he looked beyond it, he saw two more drums, partially embedded in the rock face, arranged in a staggered line, as if intended to be retrieved later, rather than left permanently. Ranger circled the cluster, nose working in tight arcs, then paused near a second pile of stones several yards away, pawing lightly at the ground, until Jackson uncovered additional barrels concealed in the same manner, the pattern too precise to be accidental dumping by storm or careless crew. Jackson's jaw tightened, not with anger but recognition, because industrial chemical disposal offshore would have required coordination and silence. And he remembered the sediment reports Whitaker had flagged in the documents below the lighthouse, noting corrosion inconsistent with natural saltwater exposure. He photographed the barrels carefully, capturing labels, serial numbers, and the position of each drum relative to the cliff wall, because evidence gathered without documentation became speculation, and speculation would not survive scrutiny in a town that valued reputation over rumor. Ranger returned to the tunnel entrance after a final sweep of the ledge, ears angled toward the interior as if hearing something deeper within the corridor, and Jackson followed him back inside as the tide began inching higher along the rock face. Halfway down the tunnel, Ranger stopped abruptly near an old electrical junction box mounted along the wall, his head tilting slightly as if tuning to a frequency Jackson could not yet hear. And when Jackson lifted the lantern closer, he noticed a faint amber flicker beneath the dust-coated casing, a small indicator light that pulsed once and then dimmed. He pried the cover open and exposed a compact marine radio unit wired into the conduit system, its casing scratched but intact. And as he adjusted the dial, a thin burst of static spilled into the tunnel, followed by 3 sharp tones that repeated in deliberate intervals. Ranger's ears locked onto the sound, posture alert but steady, and Jackson counted the spacing between pulses before retrieving Whitaker's notebook from his pack and scanning for reference, finding a margin note beside the 0217 timestamp that read Morse relay active during cycle test. The tones resumed, short, long, short, and Jackson closed his eyes briefly to translate the sequence by memory rather than chart, lips moving silently as he parsed each interval until the pattern resolved into a phrase he had already seen written on the blueprint. Dock 7. Below tide. Back in town, Emily Carter stood outside her shop as wind pushed against the harbor cranes, holding photocopies of archived documents she had retrieved earlier. And she watched Mayor Daniel Brooks step from his black SUV near the municipal building with the practiced composure of a man accustomed to controlled appearances. Brooks was tall and lean, dark hair always precisely combed, suits tailored to suggest competence rather than extravagance, and his voice during town meetings carried the steady cadence of someone who had once argued cases in polished courtrooms before returning home to frame himself as a steward of economic revival. Emily remembered reading that he had served as legal counsel for Atlantic Resource Extraction 2 decades earlier, a company that had briefly leased harbor space during infrastructure upgrades before dissolving after the winter storm that claimed Whitaker's life. And she now held copies of corporate filings linking Brooks to the firm at the exact time environmental review memos appeared in the storm archives. She crossed the street toward the building as Brooks entered, and when he paused to greet her with a measured smile that did not quite reach his eyes, she observed the faint tightening at his jaw when she mentioned Thomas Whitaker's name, a reaction subtle but unmistakable to someone who had grown up watching grown men lie gently to protect fragile truths. Emily did not accuse him outright because Cold Harbor politics favored patience over confrontation, but she asked about Dock 7's historical lease agreements under the pretense of updating marina insurance records. And Brooks responded with polished vagueness about outdated contracts and dissolved companies, insisting the storm had wiped away both structures and relevance. She noted how quickly he shifted conversation toward future tourism initiatives and lighthouse restoration grants, redirecting focus from the past to prospective revenue. And she left the building with a clearer understanding that Whitaker's concerns and Brooks's legal ties overlapped more precisely than coincidence would allow. The harbor wind felt sharper as she stepped back into the street, and she caught sight of Hank Doyle watching from his truck with narrowed eyes, the fisherman's skepticism deepening whenever outsiders or politicians stirred old stories that had settled uneasily over time. Beneath the lighthouse, Jackson secured the radio unit into his pack after documenting its wiring and signal strength, recognizing that the 0217 transmission was not random interference, but a timed relay embedded within the tunnel system, likely intended to coordinate access to Dock 7 during low tide, when retrieval of concealed materials would be easiest. Ranger paced once along the corridor, then stopped near the hatch ladder, glancing upward as though anticipating the next movement, and Jackson followed him back into the generator room, lowering the hatch quietly but not sealing it, because concealment without control only invited greater risk. He stood by the cracked window and looked toward the harbor where Dock 7 lay, partially submerged beneath late-morning tide, imagining the barrels he had just uncovered resting beneath rock until water receded enough for discreet extraction. Ranger settled at his side, amber eyes scanning the horizon through broken glass, and Jackson understood that whatever operation Whitaker had monitored had relied on timing, tide, and silence in equal measure. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Atlantic and the tide charts indicated another low cycle approaching after midnight, Jackson set up the radio unit inside the generator room, wiring it temporarily to a portable battery to confirm its schedule. And at precisely 2:17 a.m., the relay activated again with crisp Morse tones that filled the chamber with mechanical certainty. Ranger lifted his head before the first tone completed, ears forward, posture taut but controlled, and Jackson wrote down the full sequence in a small notebook before translating it once more to ensure accuracy. Dock 7. Below tide. The message did not vary, did not elaborate, and did not explain, yet its consistency transformed suspicion into structure. And as the signal faded into static, Jackson leaned back against the cold stone wall with the weight of confirmation settling into his chest. Above him, Cold Harbor slept under a quiet sky, unaware that beneath its forgotten lighthouse lay proof not only of buried barrels, but of a system designed to hide them in rhythm with the sea. Low tide arrived just before midnight under a sky stripped of clouds, the Atlantic retreating in long, quiet pulls that exposed the darker bones of Cold Harbor's shoreline, and Jackson Hale moved along the rocks beneath the lighthouse with Ranger pacing half a step ahead, the Malinois' injured pride from earlier restraint replaced by sharpened purpose, amber eyes cutting through moonlight as if the sea itself were another hostile landscape to clear. Dock 7 lay to the east of the main marina, officially condemned after the winter storm 22 years ago, its rotted planks removed and replaced by a skeletal concrete platform that jutted into the harbor like a broken tooth. And at low tide, a narrow channel of slick stone led beneath it toward a recessed cavity, hidden from open water by the pier's foundation. Jackson crouched behind a jagged outcrop and studied the tide clock on his watch, aligning it with the Morse schedule that had repeated at 02:17 for weeks, and Ranger's posture shifted before any sound reached human range, ears angling toward the pier's underside, where faint vibrations traveled through rock rather than air. They moved in controlled silence, Jackson descending first into the channel, with boots finding steady purchase on algae-slick stone, one hand braced against the pier's concrete spine, while Ranger leapt lightly beside him despite the confined space, muscles adjusting instinctively to shifting terrain. The cavity beneath Dock 7 was larger than the blueprint suggested, an excavated chamber reinforced by newer steel braces bolted against old concrete, and within it stood a row of industrial drums stacked neatly beside a portable pump system wired to a submerged pipeline that extended toward deeper water. The operation was not abandoned. It was active, organized, and concealed in the rhythm of tide cycles, and Jackson filmed the layout with a compact camera clipped to his vest, capturing labels on barrels, pump serial numbers, and a clipboard secured inside a waterproof case that listed transfer dates and volume counts in meticulous columns. Ranger circled once around the pump system, nose hovering near the intake hose, then froze with a low growl vibrating through his chest, not at the machinery, but toward the far edge of the chamber, where a narrow service ladder climbed back up toward the pier's upper deck. Jackson heard it then, the faint scrape of a boot against wood above, followed by the muted cadence of voices carried down through gaps in the planks. And Ranger's body stiffened fully, shoulders squared, weight forward, but awaiting command. 3 silhouettes appeared at the ladder's opening, descending cautiously, and as they reached the chamber floor, Jackson observed them in quick tactical assessments. The first was broad and heavy-set with a shaved head and thick forearms inked in faded maritime tattoos, likely mid-40s, movements confident rather than hurried. The second was younger, tall and lean with sharp cheekbones and nervous eyes that darted frequently toward the pump system. The third, older with graying hair beneath a knit cap, moved slower but carried himself with the steady economy of someone accustomed to manual labor rather than violence. None wore official harbor uniforms, and none expected to find anyone beneath the pier. Ranger broke first, launching forward with a controlled bark that ricocheted against concrete walls, and the broad-shouldered man swung instinctively toward the sound, raising a metal wrench as Jackson stepped into view from the shadows, posture balanced, voice level but edged with command. The younger man reached for a radio clipped to his belt, but Ranger intercepted his movement with a swift lunge that knocked him backward into stacked barrels, metal clanging sharply as one drum tilted and rolled before settling against the wall. The heavy-set man advanced, wrench raised, and Jackson closed distance the way muscle memory dictated, deflecting the strike with his forearm and pivoting to drive his shoulder into the man's torso, momentum carrying them both against the pump housing with a jarring impact that rattled the hose assembly. The older man attempted to circle behind Jackson, but Ranger disengaged from the younger target long enough to snap at the hem of the older man's jacket, forcing him to retreat toward the ladder with a startled curse. The chamber compressed into noise and movement, yet Jackson's breathing remained measured, each motion stripped of excess as if years overseas had carved away hesitation entirely, and he pinned the heavy-set man against the concrete brace with controlled pressure while the younger one scrambled for footing. Ranger lunged again to block the younger man's path toward the exit, but in the scramble, a glancing blow from a dropped wrench struck the dog's shoulder. Not deep enough to break skin, but hard enough to elicit a sharp yelp that tightened Jackson's focus into something colder. He shifted his weight, swept the heavy-set man's legs, and drove him flat onto the stone before stepping between Ranger and the remaining men, voice low and absolute as he ordered them to stand down. The older man, breathing hard, hesitated only a second before bolting up the ladder toward the pier deck, and the younger followed, leaving the heavy-set man stunned but conscious on the chamber floor. Jackson did not pursue. He secured footage of the men's faces instead, recording their retreat and the identifiable markings on the equipment they abandoned. Ranger returned to Jackson's side, limping slightly but steady, amber eyes still locked upward until the sound of boots faded across the pier above, and Jackson crouched to assess the dog's shoulder with practiced hands, fingers tracing muscle and bone beneath fur to confirm there was no fracture, only bruising that would ache but not incapacitate. He wrapped a compact bandage from his kit around the joint for support, murmuring low reassurance that carried neither panic nor sentimentality, then rose to finish documenting the chamber with renewed urgency. He collected a small sample of residue pooled near one of the barrels using a sterile vial from his pack, sealed it, and photographed the transfer logs in close detail, capturing signatures and timestamps that corresponded precisely with the Morse cycle schedule. When he finally ascended the ladder with Ranger at heel, tidewater had begun creeping back into the channel, swallowing the lower stones as if erasing footprints in real time. Across town, Emily Carter sat at a narrow desk in her shop's back office, the hum of an old desk lamp illuminating her father's archived notes spread in careful rows. And beside her sat Claire Benton, a regional investigative reporter from Portland in her late 30s, with short auburn hair and a habit of leaning forward when listening, as though proximity improved clarity. Claire had built a reputation for exposing environmental violations along Maine's coast, and although her demeanor remained calm and precise, her eyes sharpened whenever documents aligned into patterns of misconduct. Emily handed over copies of Whitaker's sediment reports and the council memos linking Atlantic resource extraction to Dock 7's restricted status, explaining in measured detail how the timeline overlapped with her father's final days before the storm. Claire listened without interruption, recording the conversation and scanning the documents with quiet intensity. And when she finally spoke, her tone carried neither sensationalism nor doubt, only the steady recognition that systemic concealment often masqueraded as civic compromise. By dawn, as first light broke over Cold Harbor's harbor and fishing boats prepared for departure, Claire transmitted preliminary findings to her newsroom, while Emily stood beside her, watching the ocean where Dock 7 lay deceptively calm above its concealed chamber. Back at the Lighthouse, Jackson reviewed the night's footage inside the generator room, Ranger resting beside him with head raised despite fatigue, and confirmed that the evidence captured, faces, equipment, chemical samples, and transfer logs, formed a chain strong enough to survive denial. He stood by the cracked window and watched the tide fully reclaim the channel beneath the pier, understanding that the truth had waited beneath cycles of water and silence for 22 years. And as Ranger leaned lightly against his leg, breathing steady despite the bruise forming beneath fur, Jackson recognized that what had begun as a signal from below had now become confrontation. The sun climbed slowly over Cold Harbor, illuminating Dock 7 as if nothing beneath it had shifted. Yet by mid-morning, the first headlines from Portland would ripple across Maine, and the chamber under the pier would no longer exist solely in tide and shadow, but in record and witness. Cold Harbor's town hall had always smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper, a modest brick building with narrow windows that let in thin afternoon light and framed the harbor beyond, like a reminder that every decision made inside those walls ultimately belonged to the sea. And on the evening Jackson Hale stepped through its doors with Ranger at heel, the atmosphere carried something sharper than routine civic concern, because Claire Benton's investigative segment had already aired across Maine that morning, showing blurred footage of industrial drums beneath Dock 7 and citing archived documents linking Atlantic resource extraction to harbor access permits signed during the year Thomas Whitaker died. The room was full in a way it had not been in years, folding chairs arranged in uneven rows, fishermen in weathered jackets sitting beside shop owners and retirees whose lives had unfolded within sight of the lighthouse. And along the side wall stood Sheriff Paul Mercer, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with sun-lined skin and a steady, restrained demeanor shaped by decades of rural law enforcement, his gray mustache trimmed neatly, posture composed yet alert, as if anticipating conflict rather than ceremony. Ranger moved beside Jackson with controlled stillness, amber eyes scanning the room, ears flicking at raised voices, but never breaking alignment with his handler's left side. Mayor Daniel Brooks stood at the front near the podium, navy suit crisp despite the tension in his jaw, dark hair combed meticulously as always, hands resting lightly on the wood surface as if anchoring himself to civility. And when he began speaking, his tone carried the same polished cadence that had reassured voters for years, framing the media coverage as premature and inflammatory, suggesting that incomplete footage could misrepresent historical infrastructure. He acknowledged Whitaker's name with solemnity, but attributed the engineer's concerns to misunderstandings amplified by storm damage and outdated environmental data. And as he spoke, he projected calm authority, the practiced composure of a former corporate attorney who knew that doubt introduced carefully could erode conviction more effectively than anger ever could. Jackson did not interrupt immediately. Instead, he stepped forward when Brooks paused for questions, placing a compact projector on the long table at the front and connecting it to the hall screen with deliberate efficiency that reminded some in the room of military briefings rather than public comment. Ranger settled beside him, head up, body still, a quiet counterweight to rising murmurs. The footage Jackson played was not dramatic in its editing because he had not staged it for spectacle, but for clarity, showing the chamber beneath Dock 7 with timestamps visible, the pump system wired to submerged pipeline, the chemical labels on barrels, and finally the faces of the 3 men who had descended the ladder during low tide, their startled reactions captured in steady frame. Gasps rippled through the room, not loud but sustained, as residents recognized one of the silhouettes as a local subcontractor who had recently secured municipal maintenance bids. And Sheriff Mercer shifted slightly, eyes narrowing as he processed the implications. Jackson then displayed photographs of the transfer logs recovered from beneath the pier, signatures matching corporate filings Emily had uncovered, dates aligning with tide cycles, and the recurring 0217 signal transmitted from beneath the lighthouse. He spoke evenly, voice low and unembellished, describing how the tunnel and radio relay functioned in coordination with low tide to conceal movement of hazardous waste. And as he did so, the lighthouse ceased to be an eccentric purchase and became instead a vantage point over a system designed for silence. Mayor Brooks responded with measured skepticism, questioning chain of custody, and suggesting the footage could depict isolated dumping unrelated to municipal oversight, his tone neither raised nor defensive, but edged with subtle dismissal. And for a moment, uncertainty flickered across several faces in the audience. It was then that Ranger stiffened abruptly, head snapping toward the hall's side windows that overlooked the harbor road, a deep growl vibrating through his chest in a frequency Jackson recognized instantly from combat zones where threat approached, before sight confirmed it. Jackson turned his head fractionally, tracking Ranger's line of attention through the glass toward a white utility truck idling near the marina entrance, its cargo bed covered with a tarp secured loosely against wind. And though the vehicle bore a generic maintenance logo, Ranger's posture shifted from alert to urgent, paw lifting as if bracing for pursuit. Without waiting for formal acknowledgement, Jackson excused himself with a brief nod and moved toward the door, Ranger at his side, while Sheriff Mercer followed instinctively, hand resting near his radio as he stepped into the cooling evening air. Outside, the white truck began rolling toward the harbor exit, tires crunching over gravel with unhurried intent, and Ranger's growl intensified as he advanced to the edge of the parking lot, nose angled toward the truck bed. Jackson raised a hand to steady the dog, then called out to the driver with a voice that carried across the marina without shouting, requesting the vehicle remain for inspection. The truck hesitated, then accelerated slightly, a subtle but telling shift, and Sheriff Mercer radioed for backup while moving to block the exit with his cruiser parked at an angle. Within minutes, flashing lights appeared at the Harbor Road entrance as 2 Maine State Police vehicles arrived, followed closely by a marked SUV bearing the insignia of the Environmental Protection Agency's Regional Enforcement Division. From the federal vehicle stepped Agent Laura Kim, mid-30s, sharp-eyed and composed, dark hair pulled into a low ponytail beneath a navy windbreaker, her expression focused rather than confrontational, accustomed to stepping into local controversies with procedural precision rather than emotion. The truck was stopped before it could clear the marina boundary, and under Agent Kim's direction, the tarp was removed to reveal sealed industrial drums, matching those documented beneath Dock 7. Labels partially obscured, but consistent with hazardous solvent waste not authorized for municipal transport. Ranger barked once, sharp and definitive, then fell silent as if confirming the identification, and Jackson stood beside him without triumph, only steady validation. Agent Kim ordered immediate impound and initiated environmental hazard protocols, her voice calm but decisive as she coordinated with state officers to secure the vehicle and preserve evidence. Inside Town Hall, word spread quickly, and when Sheriff Mercer escorted Mayor Brooks outside to observe the unfolding seizure, the mayor's composure faltered only briefly, eyes narrowing at the sight of federal insignia and sealed drums illuminated beneath patrol lights. Back inside the hall, residents clustered in uneasy groups, murmurs shifting from confusion to recognition as the scale of concealment became undeniable. And Claire Benton, who had positioned herself discreetly near the back row, continued recording events with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that narrative clarity required patience rather than provocation. Emily Carter stood near the aisle, arms folded tightly, not in defensiveness, but in containment of emotion that had waited 2 decades for context. And when Brooks returned under escort, Agent Kim informed him formally that he was being detained pending investigation into concealment of hazardous disposal operations tied to historical and ongoing environmental violations. The announcement did not explode into applause or outrage. Instead, a dense silence settled over the hall, heavy and sobering, as if the town collectively exhaled and inhaled at once, recalibrating its understanding of the past. Sheriff Mercer read the charges with measured gravity, and Brooks, stripped now of podium and posture, looked smaller against the flashing lights reflecting through the hall windows, his earlier rhetoric dissolving into procedural responses as he was guided toward a waiting vehicle. Ranger remained at Jackson's side, posture relaxed but watchful, shoulder brushing lightly against his handler's leg, and as the sirens faded down the harbor road, the residents of Cold Harbor stood in quiet clusters, facing one another with expressions that carried less fear than clarity. Someone near the back murmured that the lighthouse had never been cursed, only silenced, and the phrase traveled through the room not as accusation, but realization, because the tower that had stood dark for 22 years was now understood as witness rather than omen. Jackson did not address the crowd again. He simply nodded once to Sheriff Mercer and to Emily, then stepped outside with Ranger beneath a sky clearing slowly over the Atlantic, the harbor lights reflecting off water that had hidden truth beneath its tides. The lighthouse rose in silhouette against the horizon, no longer a relic of superstition but a marker of endurance. And as the town watched the mayor's vehicle disappear into the night, Cold Harbor awakened to the knowledge that what had been called haunted was in fact suppressed, and that the sea had carried secrets only until someone chose to listen. 3 months after the arrests and federal investigations that unraveled the silence around Dock 7, Cold Harbor felt altered in ways that were less dramatic than a headline, yet more permanent than a verdict. The harbor air carrying the same salt and diesel scent it always had, but no longer weighed down by suspicion that hovered unnamed over docks and council meetings. The Whitaker Lighthouse no longer stood as a dark relic at the edge of town. Scaffolding had wrapped its weathered stone for weeks while restoration crews repaired cracked glass in the lantern room and reinforced the balcony railing. And now the tower rose renewed against the Atlantic sky, its paint restored to clean white, its ironwork treated and sealed, its windows reflecting evening light rather than swallowing it. The restoration was overseen by Eleanor Price, a preservation architect from Portland in her early 40s, with sharp features and steady green eyes. Her auburn hair usually tucked beneath a hard hat as she paced the grounds with blueprint roll in hand. A woman who had spent years fighting to save maritime landmarks from decay, and whose calm authority masked the quiet resolve forged during her own battle to preserve a historic lighthouse in Bar Harbor that nearly collapsed under bureaucratic neglect. Eleanor spoke rarely in grand gestures, preferring methodical action over symbolic declarations, and she treated the Whitaker Lighthouse not as an aesthetic trophy, but as a testimony restored. The tunnel beneath the lighthouse had been sealed permanently under supervision of environmental authorities, its hazardous sections reinforced and closed, but the upper corridor and maintenance chamber were preserved safely and transformed into a small exhibit, accessible from a new side entrance built discreetly into the cliff face, and inside that space-glass cases now displayed Thomas Whitaker's recovered reports, sediment analysis charts, and the blueprint marked Dock 7. Below tide, each document framed not as accusation, but as acknowledgment of a man who attempted to warn before he was silenced by storm and politics alike. A bronze plaque at the entrance bore Whitaker's name, alongside those of others who had spoken quietly in the past and were dismissed, and townspeople who once avoided the lighthouse now walked its lower hall with cautious reverence, reading words they had never seen in full. Sheriff Paul Mercer often stopped by in the late afternoons, hat removed respectfully as he studied the exhibits, his weathered face softened by understanding that law enforcement sometimes arrives too late, but still must arrive. Jackson Hale had declined public praise when the investigations concluded, yet he did not retreat into anonymity. Instead, he converted the lighthouse's lower level into the Cold Harbor Veterans Support Center, a modest but deliberate space furnished with worn leather chairs, a long wooden table built by local carpenters, and shelves lined with resource guides and framed photographs of men and women from Maine who had served in conflicts overseas. The idea was not spectacle, but refuge, and Jackson worked alongside a retired Army medic named Thomas Reed, a tall, soft-spoken man in his early 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and kind, steady eyes that had witnessed too many field triage tents to ever dismiss quiet suffering. Reed's left hand bore faint tremor from nerve damage sustained during an IED blast years earlier. Yet his presence radiated calm assurance, and together he and Jackson organized weekly meetings where veterans could sit without pretense, share without pressure, and simply exist without the weight of expectation. The lighthouse, once labeled cursed, now carried the low hum of conversation and coffee rather than rumor. Ranger had healed fully by then, the bruise on his shoulder long faded into a small crescent scar beneath sable fur, and his stride regained the effortless precision that marked his years as a military working dog, though he now moved with less urgency and more observation, content to rest beside the center's doorway during meetings, as if guarding not against threat, but against isolation. Children visiting the lighthouse often asked to pet him, and Jackson allowed it carefully. Ranger lowering himself gently to accommodate small hands, amber eyes soft but attentive, because he understood instinctively the difference between chaos and trust. In the evenings, when veterans departed and chairs were stacked neatly along the wall, Ranger followed Jackson up the spiral staircase to the lantern room, paws steady on each step, pausing only briefly at the landing, where wind slipped through cracked frames, now replaced by reinforced glass. Across town, Emily Carter's life had shifted as well, though not through spectacle, but through quiet reconstruction. The boat repair shop she inherited had expanded into a new shipbuilding workshop along the marina's eastern edge, its timber beams fresh and solid, its name painted clearly above the wide sliding doors. Whitaker Marine Works. The name honored her father, and by extension, Thomas Whitaker, whose commitment to integrity had outlasted attempts to bury it beneath tide and contract. Emily stood often at the entrance of the workshop at dawn, sleeves rolled up over lean forearms, strengthened by years of labor, hair tied back against the wind, directing apprentices as they shaped hull frames with careful measurement rather than rushed production. Among those apprentices was a young woman named Lily Grant, barely 20, freckled and earnest, who had left a corporate internship in Portland to learn practical craft after watching the Dock 7 revelations unfold on the news, inspired by the idea that transparency could begin in small coastal towns rather than distant capitals. Emily's leadership was steady and direct, tempered by loss yet no longer defined by it, and the hum of saws and mallets within the workshop replaced the hollow echo of unanswered questions that once lingered over her family's history. Federal investigations concluded with indictments beyond the mayor's arrest, revealing a network of contracted transport operators and shell companies linked to Atlantic resource extraction. And though legal proceedings continued in distant courtrooms, Cold Harbor felt the immediate relief of knowing the concealment had ended. Agent Laura Kim returned briefly to oversee final environmental remediation assessments. Her sharp gaze softened slightly when she walked through the lighthouse exhibit, acknowledging that evidence preserved carefully could alter not only verdicts, but narratives. She spoke quietly with Jackson about ongoing monitoring protocols, ensuring that no remnant of the illegal pipeline remained active, and before departing she paused to kneel beside Ranger, offering a brief scratch behind his ear with a rare smile that carried professional respect. The evening the lighthouse light returned was announced not with fireworks, but with a simple gathering along the rocky shoreline, townspeople assembling as the restored beacon prepared to rotate for the first time in over 2 decades. Eleanor Price stood near the control panel inside the lantern room, hands steady on the polished brass lever, while Jackson and Ranger waited just behind her, the dog seated calmly with tail curled loosely against the floor. As the mechanism engaged, the light ignited in a smooth arc, its beam cutting through the growing dusk and sweeping across ocean mist that hovered low over the Atlantic, illuminating water that had once hidden secrets and now reflected transparency. A murmur moved through the crowd below, not celebratory but reverent, and Emily stood among them, with Lily and Thomas Reed, watching the beam trace its path outward toward open sea. Jackson stepped onto the balcony as twilight deepened, the Atlantic breeze lifting lightly against his jacket, and Ranger rose to sit beside him, shoulder brushing his leg in familiar alignment. From that vantage point, Cold Harbor appeared unchanged in structure, yet transformed in spirit, the marina lights steady, Dock 7 visible as a quiet outline rather than a concealed artery, and the restored beacon casting deliberate circles through fog that parted obediently before its glow. Jackson rested one hand on the railing and the other briefly against Ranger's neck, feeling the warmth of living presence rather than the cold weight of suspicion. And as the beam completed another rotation, he understood that the lighthouse had never been haunted, only muted by fear and complicity. Now there were no hidden signals at 0217, no concealed barrels beneath tide, no silence imposed by authority, only a steady light turning outward over water that no longer carried unspoken cargo. The sea stretched beyond the horizon without secrecy, and beside him, Ranger watched quietly, scar barely visible against healed fur, as the lighthouse fulfilled its original purpose once more. There were no ghosts left in the stone, only illumination, and in that rotating beam, Cold Harbor found not absolution, but clarity, the kind that does not erase the past, but refuses to let it remain buried. The light moved again across mist and wave, and this time nothing remained in shadow except distance, because the tower stood no longer as a warning of silence, but as proof that truth, once exposed, does not dim again. The final lesson of this story is simple but powerful. The lighthouse was never haunted. It was silenced, just like many truths in our lives that are buried under fear or compromise. When one man chose courage, when one loyal dog trusted his instinct, and when one woman refused to forget, the light returned. That is how God often works. Not always through thunder or miracles in the sky, but through faithful hearts who refuse to look away. In our daily lives, we all face moments where it is easier to stay quiet. But this story reminds us that when we stand for truth, God strengthens us, and light will always overcome darkness. If this message touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. Comment below what part moved you the most. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith and redemption. May God bless you and your family, protect your path, and fill your life with light. If you believe truth always wins, type Amen in the comments.